In the days we live in, I honestly can't think of one person that has not been affected in some way or another by infidelity. Unfaithfulness in the marriage relationship is like a plague that has touched almost every person in our world. If you haven't been touched by it, then you probably know someone who has been. Join me today as we take a quick look at the Proverbs and look at Solomon's warnings about committing adultery. Read with me Proverbs chapter 6, verse 30 through 35. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger when he is starving. Yet, if he is caught, he must pay sevenfold, though it costs him all the wealth of his house. But a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. Blows and disgrace are his lot, and his shame will never be wiped away. For jealousy arouses a husband's fury, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge. He will not accept any compensation. He will refuse a bribe, however great it is. Solomon continues his warnings about adultery in these verses by contrasting it with another of the 10 Commandments, the prohibition of stealing. The first thing that he points out is adultery causes irreparable damage. When a person steals to sustain their life and continue to survive, they're not usually condemned for such a crime. They are considered guilty in a court of law, but the desperation of their situation makes room for mercy. There still has to be restitution made for the loss of what was stolen, and sometimes a thief will have to pay a very great price. To steal another person's spouse through adultery is another matter. In that case, there is often no room for compassion. What has been stolen cannot be restored. The reason for the act of adultery is never for the sustaining of life like the person who steals to eat. Instead, it's usually born out of a selfish desire to satisfy an ungodly sexual appetite. Unlike the thief that steals to survive, the adulterer gets no pity for destroying someone's family. And there is no way for someone who commits adultery to make restitution to the offended spouse or the offended family. Next, we see in verse 32 that adultery is the ultimate act of foolishness. People who commit the sin of adultery demonstrate that they have no sense. To give into this sin requires a serious lack of good judgment and discernment. We all have moments of indiscretion when we make bad decisions, but no one with sound judgment or in their right mind would intentionally break the promises of their marriage vows like that, especially if they understood the consequences of their actions. In the end, self-destruction is the result of the act of adultery. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6:18, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body." The damage that it causes affects both the inner soul and their physical being. Lives are ruined from the inside out. Families, spouses, and children suffer. Now, the last thing we see is that adultery causes deep wounds and inflames jealousy. Adultery inflicts permanent wounds that those involved will have to endure the rest of their lives. The shame and disgrace that adulterers bring on themselves and on their loved ones become permanent marks on their character and their reputation. Sometimes even death is not enough to erase those marks. But those who live on will remember their heartless and immoral deeds. Often the adulterers will have to face the offended spouse. And because of the spouse's deep hurt, they may seek revenge and never be satisfied by any attempt at restitution. Adultery is an attack on the essential and most important part of the marriage relationship, the physical and emotional intimacy. And that part exclusively belongs to the spouse. When it is taken, it cannot be given back. It has been wrongfully experienced and enjoyed, and it cannot be returned. Only God has the power to bring healing and restoration. Even though the sin is committed and the consequences remain, God can bring beauty from ashes and redemption from great loss. 1 John 1:9 says, "If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness." And when Jesus proclaimed His mission, He quoted Isaiah 61, which says this, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor." Jesus offers forgiveness and redemption to all that turn to Him for salvation. All the adulterer needs to do to experience that healing is to confess the sin and earnestly turn back to loving and serving the Lord. If that's you, if you have fallen away from God's plan for your relationships, then turn back to God now and let Him give you mercy, grace, and healing.